All right, let's go. In 2006, researchers at the University of Dresden placed a 17th century Damascus sword under an electron microscope. What they found inside the blade was carbon nanotubes, structures so small they exist at the molecular level, structures that modern science first synthesized in 1991. A medieval blacksmith had produced nanotechnology 800 years before any laboratory on Earth knew it existed. And that sword isn't even the most disturbing artifact on this list. Number 10. The Sutton Hoo helmet. In the summer of 1939, a landowner named Edith Pretty hired a self-taught archaeologist named Basil Brown to excavate a series of mounds on her property near Woodbridge, Suffolk. What Brown uncovered inside Mound 1 was a 27-meter-long Anglo-Saxon ship burial, the most significant archaeological discovery in British history. And at the center of the burial chamber, crushed into fragments by the weight of centuries of collapsing earth, was a helmet. It took conservators at the British Museum decades to fully reconstruct it. The helmet had been shattered into over 500 fragments by the weight of the soil above. What emerged was not the crude iron cap that historians expected from a so-called Dark Ages warrior. The Sutton Hoo helmet was a masterwork of engineering and artistry, an iron cap overlaid with tinned bronze panels, each stamped with interlocking designs of warriors, serpents, and flying figures. The face mask featured copper eyebrows inlaid with silver wire and capped with gilded boar heads. A dragon motif stretched across the crest, its body forming the nose guard, its tail curving over the skull. The entire surface was covered in decorative panels, depicting scenes of mounted warriors and fallen enemies, martial propaganda stamped into metal. The craftsmanship combined Roman military tradition with Scandinavian Vendel art styles, proof that Anglo-Saxon England was not isolated. It was a node in a continental network. The helmet's design showed direct connections to workshops in Sweden, the Rhineland, and the Byzantine Mediterranean. Garnets cut in the cloisonné technique matched stones traced to deposits in Sri Lanka and India. A single helmet on a single skull contained materials sourced from 3 continents. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. For over a century, mainstream scholarship had called this period the Dark Ages, a cultural wasteland between the fall of Rome and the rise of medieval civilization. The Sutton Hoo helmet obliterated that narrative. This was not the product of barbarians squatting in Roman ruins. This was the product of a society with transcontinental trade networks, master goldsmiths, and a king wealthy enough to be buried with enough treasure to fill a museum gallery. The helmet is dated to approximately 625 AD. It almost certainly belonged to Raedwald, king of East Anglia, one of only 4 complete Anglo-Saxon helmets ever found in all of England. The burial itself contained 263 objects: Byzantine silver, Merovingian gold coins, a 6-stringed lyre, drinking horns mounted in silver, an iron standard, a ceremonial whetstone scepter. An entire civilization's sophistication was sitting under a farmer's field for 1,300 years. Consider the implication. The Sutton Hoo burial was discovered in 1939, the same year World War II began. For the next 4 decades, the British public's understanding of their own early medieval history was shaped by a handful of objects dug up from one mound in Suffolk. There are at least 17 other mounds at the Sutton Hoo site. Most remain unexcavated. And Suffolk is one county in one country. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms stretched from Northumbria to Kent, from Mercia to Wessex. Each had royal burials. Most have never been found. The truly disturbing aspect isn't what the helmet revealed about Anglo-Saxon England. It's what it revealed about us. We called an entire millennium dark because we hadn't bothered to dig. The question isn't what the Sutton Hoo helmet proved about the 7th century. It's what still lies under every other farmer's field in England. Number 9. The Staffordshire Hoard. On July 5, 2009, a metal detectorist named Terry Herbert was scanning a plowed field near Lichfield, Staffordshire. His detector signaled gold. Then it signaled again, and again. Over 5 days, Herbert recovered 244 items. When professional archaeologists arrived, they recovered thousands more. The final count: 4,600 individual items and fragments. 5. 1 kilograms of gold. 1. 4 kilograms of silver. 3,500 pieces of garnet cloisonné jewelry. The largest collection of Anglo-Saxon gold ever found. Anywhere. In the world. But here's the anomaly that rewrote the textbooks. Nearly every item was war gear. Sword pommels, hilt fittings, helmet cheek pieces, scabbard bosses, and they had been deliberately stripped from their weapons. The blades were gone. Only the gold and silver fittings remained, ripped from the hilts of what scholars estimate were at least 100 individual swords. This wasn't a treasure chest. This was a battlefield trophy collection. Someone, likely a Mercian king during the turbulent 7th century, had defeated multiple enemies and ritually stripped the precious fittings from their weapons. The practice has no parallel in the archaeological record at this scale. Whoever buried this hoard was making a statement about power, and that statement was made in gold, ripped from the swords of the dead. Kevin Leahy, finds advisor for the Portable Antiquities Scheme, called the hoard of radical importance. Before this discovery, scholars had fewer than a dozen examples of complete Anglo-Saxon sword hilt sets. The Staffordshire Hoard delivered over 100 in one field. It was the equivalent of an astronomer who had spent a career studying 12 stars suddenly being handed a catalogue of 1,000. The garnet work proved that Anglo-Saxon jewelers were using techniques previously thought to have been exclusive to Byzantine and Frankish workshops. The cloisonné cells were cut to tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. Each garnet individually shaped, backed with gold foil stamped with a waffle pattern to amplify its color. The precision required magnification. The 7th century had no magnifying lenses. The question of how they achieved sub-millimeter accuracy with the naked eye remains unanswered. And then there were the crosses. Among the war gear, conservators found folded Christian crosses and a gold strip inscribed with a biblical passage from the Book of Numbers. "Rise up, Lord, and let thine enemies be scattered." This was not a pagan warlord's hall. This was a Christian king who believed God fought beside him, and who proved it by stripping the swords of his enemies and burying their fittings in consecrated earth. To put the scale of this discovery in perspective, before the Staffordshire Hoard, the total amount of Anglo-Saxon gold known to archaeology across all of England was approximately 1.5 kilograms. Terry Herbert found more than 3 times that amount in a single field in 5 days. The entire academic understanding of Anglo-Saxon metalwork was based on a sample size that this one discovery tripled overnight. And the field itself has not been fully excavated. Geophysical surveys suggest additional material remains buried at the site. Whatever else is down there, whatever the Mercian king chose not to strip, or whatever was deposited in a separate cache, remains under the soil of Staffordshire. The Staffordshire Hoard didn't just rewrite Anglo-Saxon history. It proved that the boundary between Christian piety and warrior violence in 7th century England didn't exist. They were the same thing. And it proved that the archaeological record we've been building for 2 centuries is a fraction, a thin sample, of what is still waiting under the surface of a country that has been continuously farmed for 1,000 years. Number 8. The Hidden Cities of Angkor. For over a century, Angkor Wat was understood as the world's largest religious monument. A single temple complex built by the Khmer Empire in the early 12th century. Archaeologists mapped the moat, catalogued the bas-reliefs, and measured the 5 towers. They thought they understood its scale. They were wrong by a factor of 10. In April 2012, archaeologist Damien Evans mounted a LiDAR scanner, a laser-based remote sensing instrument, on a helicopter and flew over 370 square kilometers of Cambodian jungle in 20 hours. The laser pulses penetrated the forest canopy and mapped the ground beneath with centimeter-level precision. What the data revealed was the imprint of an entire civilization that no one had seen in 600 years. Hidden beneath the trees were city blocks, road networks, reservoir systems, temple foundations, residential grids, water management infrastructure spanning hundreds of square kilometers. The 12th century Khmer capital, Angkor, didn't cover 9 square kilometers as previously mapped. It covered more than 35 square kilometers of formally planned urban space, larger than the medieval footprint of Paris, London, and Constantinople combined. But here's where the discovery becomes genuinely disturbing. The LiDAR scans revealed a city on Phnom Kulen, 40 kilometers north of Angkor Wat, that no one knew existed. Inscriptions had named it Mahendra Parvata, the mountain capital where Jayavarman II declared Khmer independence from Java in 802 AD. Scholars assumed it was a minor ceremonial site. The LiDAR showed a dense urban grid larger than modern-day Phnom Penh. At its peak in the 13th century, the greater Angkor metropolitan area may have supported between 750,000 and 1 million people. This made it the largest pre-industrial city on Earth, a fact that was invisible until 2012, because every structure except the stone temples had been built from wood, which decomposed and was swallowed by jungle. The water management system alone is staggering. The Khmer engineers constructed a network of barais, enormous rectangular reservoirs, the largest of which, the West Barai, measures 8 kilometers by 2.1 kilometers and held an estimated 56 million cubic meters of water. That is enough water to supply a city of 1 million people for an entire dry season. The system included canals, distribution channels, and overflow mechanisms that regulated water flow across hundreds of square kilometers of rice paddies. This was hydraulic engineering on an industrial scale, designed, built, and maintained by a medieval civilization that most Western historians barely mentioned in their textbooks until the 21st century. Evans published his findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2013. He had imaged 370 square kilometers. Cambodia's total land area is 181,035 square kilometers. Less than 0.2% of the country has been surveyed with LiDAR. The results from that fraction revealed the largest pre-industrial city on Earth. The truly unsettling implication isn't what the LiDAR found, it's the methodology. If the most advanced medieval city on Earth was hiding in plain sight for a century because no one thought to look beneath the canopy, how many other civilizations are buried under forests, deserts, and farmland that we haven't scanned yet? The answer, based on the hit rate of every LiDAR survey conducted so far, is almost certainly more than we're prepared to find. Number 7. The Book of Kells. Sometime around 800 AD, on the remote island monastery of Iona off the western coast of Scotland, monks began creating a book. They would work on it for decades. What they produced is 680 pages of the 4 Gospels of the New Testament and 2,000 illustrations, so intricate, so geometrically precise, so impossibly detailed that when examined under magnification in the 19th century, scholars at Trinity College Dublin could not determine how they were made. Consider the Chi Rho page, folio 34R. It depicts the Greek letters Chi and Rho, the monogram of Christ. The decoration fills the entire page. Under magnification, a single square inch of the design contains interlocking spirals, knotwork, animal forms, and human figures drawn with lines thinner than a human hair. Some lines measure 0.25 millimeters wide. A modern technical pen has a minimum width of 0.13 millimeters, These monks were working at the physical limit of human vision, using quill pens made from goose feathers. There are no sketching lines, no corrections, no evidence of preliminary drawings underneath the final work. The monks appear to have drawn each line once, correctly, without guides. Between 2004 and 2006, researchers used micro-Raman spectroscopy to analyze the pigments. They found orpiment, an arsenic sulfide mineral from the Mediterranean, verdigris from copper, red lead, and a deep blue that had been identified for a century as lapis lazuli, imported from Afghanistan. It wasn't. The spectroscopy revealed it was woad, a plant dye available in the Scottish Highlands. The monks weren't importing exotic pigments across continents. They were engineering the appearance of luxury from local materials, using layering techniques so sophisticated that they fooled pigment experts for over 100 years. But here's the detail that makes the Book of Kells genuinely disturbing. It was created during the Viking raids on Iona. The monastery was attacked in 795, 802, 806, and 825 AD. In the 806 raid, 68 monks were killed on a single day at a site still called Martyrs Bay. The surviving community fled to Kells in Ireland, carrying the unfinished manuscript with them across the sea. This means the most detailed illuminated manuscript in human history was produced by men who were simultaneously being hunted and killed. They worked by candlelight. They worked between raids. They worked knowing the next attack could destroy everything. And they made something so precise that modern scholars still cannot fully explain how hands under that kind of pressure produced lines that steady. In 2022, an experimental archaeologist attempted to recreate a single page of the Book of Kells using period-accurate tools: goose quill, hand-ground pigments, vellum prepared from calf skin. The work took several weeks for one page. The Book of Kells contains 680 pages. At that rate, the manuscript would require decades of continuous work by multiple scribes, a timeline that overlaps almost exactly with the period of the Viking raids. The Book of Kells is housed at Trinity College, Dublin, where roughly 500,000 visitors view it each year. 2 pages are displayed at a time, turned regularly. The remaining 678 pages sit in controlled storage. A 1,200-year-old encyclopedia of artistic achievement that no one alive fully understands, created by men whose monastery was burned around them, using techniques that have not been replicated with modern tools. And the names of every single person who made it are unknown. Number 6. The Bayeux Tapestry. It is not a tapestry. It is an embroidery. 70 meters of linen stitched with wool thread in 10 colors, depicting the events leading to the Norman conquest of England in 1066. It contains 623 human figures, 202 horses, 55 dogs, 505 other animals, 37 buildings, 41 ships, and 93 donkeys. It was made within a decade of the conquest itself, and nobody knows who made it. The leading theory is that it was commissioned by Bishop Odo of Bayeux, William the Conqueror's half-brother, and stitched by Anglo-Saxon women in Canterbury, the conquered people sewing their own defeat into fabric. But recent fiber analysis suggests the wool wasn't English. The artistic style shows strong Norman characteristics. In the organizational scale, at 70 meters, it would require dozens of skilled embroiderers working simultaneously for months or years, points to a large continental workshop rather than a small English scriptorium. But here's where the Bayeux Tapestry becomes something more than a historical record. It lies. Or, more precisely, it tells the truth from a very specific angle. The Norman narrative dominates every scene. Harold Godwinson is shown swearing an oath on holy relics, an event that may or may not have happened. The tapestry presents it as historical fact, justifying William's invasion as a response to a broken, sacred promise. Every scene is arranged to make the Norman invasion look not just inevitable, but righteous. And then there is the scene that scholars cannot explain. A panel showing a priest touching a woman's face, with the Latin caption, "Where a certain cleric and elf Giva." No surname, no context, no explanation. The scene is surrounded by overtly sexual imagery in the borders, naked male figures and provocative poses. Whatever scandal this referred to was so well known in 1070 that the embroiderers assumed it needed no explanation. 1,000 years later, the meaning is completely lost. An entire medieval political scandal, apparently significant enough to include in the most important visual record of the conquest, has been erased by time. David Bernstein of Sarah Lawrence College spent decades studying the tapestry and concluded that its apparently naive images conceal multiple layers of political meaning. The Bayeux Tapestry didn't just record the Norman conquest. It was the Norman conquest's propaganda department, the medieval equivalent of a state-controlled documentary, stitched into a format that would survive for a millennium. And it worked. Most people today understand the conquest through the tapestry's version of events. The tapestry itself nearly didn't survive. During the French Revolution, it was reportedly used to cover military wagons. A local lawyer intervened and had it stored in the town hall. It survived 2 world wars. In 1944, the SS attempted to transport it to Germany as the Allies approached Normandy. The order was never carried out. The most influential piece of political propaganda in European history survived by accident, multiple times. The truly disturbing aspect isn't that a medieval artifact contains political propaganda. It's that we've been reading it as history for 950 years. And the final 8 meters of the tapestry are missing. Whatever the embroiderers depicted after the Battle of Hastings, William's coronation, the suppression of English resistance, the harrying of the North, is gone. The ending of the story was cut off. By whom and why is another question that has no answer. Number 5. The Hereford Mappa Mundi. In a quiet corner of Hereford Cathedral in England, mounted behind glass, sits the largest surviving medieval map of the world. It was drawn around 1300 AD on a single sheet of vellum made from calfskin. 59 meters by 1.34 meters. It contains over 500 ink drawings, 420 cities and towns, 15 biblical events, 33 animals, plants, and birds, 32 images of the peoples of the world, and 5 scenes from classical mythology. It is, by any measure, an encyclopedia of everything the medieval mind believed to be true about the physical world. Jerusalem sits at the center. East is at the top. The Garden of Eden occupies the uppermost edge, beyond the known world. Britain appears at the bottom left, almost an afterthought. Africa is labeled with images of people with their faces in their chests. The Blemmies, described by Pliny the Elder, 1,000 years before the map was drawn. Sciapods, creatures with a single enormous foot used as a sunshade, inhabit the margins. Sea monsters patrol the oceans. For centuries, historians used the Mappa Mundi as evidence that medieval Europeans were geographically ignorant, that they genuinely believed the world was populated by monsters, and that Jerusalem was the physical center of the planet. This interpretation is wrong. Richard de Bello, the cleric believed to have created the map, was not drawing geography. He was drawing theology. The Mappa Mundi is not a navigation tool. It is a visual argument about humanity's place in God's creation. Every image, every placement, every scale distortion is deliberate. Jerusalem is at the center because Christ's sacrifice is the center of history. The monsters at the edges represent the unknown, not in geographic terms, but in theological ones. The boundary of the known world is the boundary of salvation. But here's where the standard dismissal falls apart. Alongside the theological imagery, the map contains geographical information of startling accuracy. The shape of the Mediterranean is recognizable. Major rivers, the Nile, the Danube, the Don, are placed correctly relative to each other. Trade routes are marked with precision that required first-hand merchant knowledge. The medieval mapmaker knew perfectly well what the Mediterranean looked like. He chose to subordinate geography to meaning. In 1988, Hereford Cathedral nearly sold the Mappa Mundi at auction to raise funds for building repairs. Sotheby's estimated its value at £3.5 million. Public outcry halted the sale. The National Heritage Memorial Fund and a private donor contributed funds to keep it in Hereford. UNESCO later inscribed it on the Memory of the World Register, recognizing it as one of the most significant documents in human history. A map that the modern world spent centuries dismissing as proof of medieval ignorance turned out to be proof of medieval intelligence. A system of knowledge organization so different from our own that we couldn't recognize it as knowledge at all. The Hereford Mappa Mundi didn't reveal that medieval people were ignorant. It revealed that they organized knowledge by importance rather than measurement. And the truly unsettling implication is that we've been reading their maps wrong for 700 years, projecting our values onto a system that operated on entirely different principles. The question isn't whether medieval map makers understood geography. It's how many other medieval systems of knowledge we're currently misreading because we assume they should look like ours. Number 4. Damascus steel. In 2006, Peter Poffler and his team at the Technical University of Dresden published a paper in the journal Nature that sent a shockwave through materials science. Using high-resolution transmission electron microscopy, they analyzed a 17th-century Damascus saber and found carbon nanotubes, cylindrical structures of carbon atoms arranged in a hexagonal lattice, each measuring roughly 50 nanometers in length. Carbon nanotubes were first observed by Sumio Ijima at NEC Laboratories in 1991. They are among the strongest materials known to science, 100 times stronger than steel at 1/6 the weight. They are a cornerstone of modern nanotechnology, and they were embedded in a sword forged at least 300 years earlier. The swords were forged from Wootz steel, small cakes of crucible steel produced in India and Sri Lanka, then shipped along Indian Ocean trade routes to smiths in Syria, Persia, and the Middle East. The carbon content of Wootz reached 1.5 to 2%, far higher than any European steel of the period. The forging process involved repeated cycles of heating and cooling, during which trace impurities in the ore, vanadium, chromium, manganese, cobalt, nickel, segregated into bands. These impurities acted as catalysts, triggering the spontaneous formation of carbon nanotubes along the cementite boundaries. The result was the legendary Damascus blade pattern, flowing lines visible on the surface, called the watered pattern. But the pattern wasn't decoration. It was the visible signature of an internal nanostructure that gave the blade both hardness and flexibility, properties that are normally mutually exclusive in metallurgy. A Damascus blade could hold an edge sharp enough to split a hair while absorbing combat impacts that would shatter a conventional steel sword. The implications extend beyond metallurgy. Carbon nanotubes are not decorative. They are functional at the molecular level, distributing stress across the blade matrix, preventing crack propagation, creating a material that combined cutting performance with structural resilience in ways that modern engineers still struggle to achieve simultaneously. The medieval smiths who forged Damascus blades did not know the word nanotube. They did not have electron microscopes. They had fire, steel, and centuries of accumulated empirical knowledge passed from master to apprentice. And they produced a material that a team of materials scientists in 2006 needed a transmission electron microscope operating at 200 kilovolts to even detect. And then it stopped. By the mid-18th century, Damascus steel could no longer be produced. The specific combination of trace minerals in the Indian ore deposits was exhausted. Without knowing which impurities and which concentrations triggered the nanotube formation, no smith could replicate the process. The knowledge didn't die because it was forgotten. It died because the raw material was consumed. Modern metallurgists have spent decades trying to reverse engineer the process. None have fully succeeded. The specific ore is gone. The specific technique, the exact temperatures, the exact number of heating cycles, the exact quenching medium, died with the last smiths who practiced it. A medieval blacksmith, working with a charcoal forge and a hammer, produced a nanostructure that the most advanced laboratories on Earth identified only in 2006, and still cannot reliably replicate. The technology didn't advance. It was lost. And the gap between what a 17th century smith could do and what a 21st century laboratory cannot do remains one of the most uncomfortable facts in the history of materials science. Number 3. Greek fire. In 672 AD, an Arab fleet of several hundred ships sailed toward Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The city had been besieged before and had always held. But this time, the Umayyad Caliphate committed an armada large enough to blockade the Bosphorus and starve the city into submission. The siege lasted 4 years. Constantinople should have fallen. It didn't. Because of a substance that shouldn't have existed. According to the Byzantine chronicler Theophanes, a Syrian refugee named Kallinikos presented Emperor Constantine IV with a new weapon, a liquid that could be projected from bronze siphons mounted on the prows of ships. When it struck enemy vessels, it ignited. When the crews tried to extinguish it with water, it burned harder. When it landed on the sea surface, it continued burning. The Arab fleet was destroyed. The Byzantines called it liquid fire, or sea fire. History remembers it as Greek fire, and its exact composition has been lost for over 800 years. What we know. It was a petroleum-based compound, likely incorporating crude naphtha from natural seeps in the Crimean Peninsula or Mesopotamia. It probably contained pine resin as a thickening agent, sulfur as an accelerant, and possibly quicklime, calcium oxide, which reacts violently with water, generating intense heat on contact. This would explain why water made it burn hotter rather than extinguishing it. The delivery system was equally extraordinary. Bronze siphons, essentially medieval flamethrowers, pressurized the mixture and projected it as a continuous stream of burning liquid, up to 15 meters. The system could be mounted on ship prows, city walls, or handheld ceramic grenades thrown by infantry. No other military in the medieval world possessed anything comparable. The closest analogy in modern warfare is napalm, which wasn't developed until 1942. The formula was guarded with obsessive secrecy. Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos, writing in the 10th century, explicitly warned his son, "This fire is made by the following arts. You must above all take care that the secret of Greek fire shall not be given to any nation whatsoever." The recipe was restricted to a single family lineage and transmitted orally, never written down. The Byzantines understood that this weapon was the difference between survival and annihilation, and they treated its formula accordingly. When the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople in 1204, the Crusaders searched for the formula. They never found it. By that point, the chain of oral transmission had already been broken. Arab engineers tried for centuries to replicate it. They failed. The formula died with the empire that created it. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical weapon. Arab chroniclers described Greek fire with a terror that borders on the supernatural. Ships' crews refused to close with Byzantine vessels. Entire fleets reversed course at the sight of the siphon tubes. The weapon didn't just destroy ships, it destroyed the willingness to fight. A single technology, wielded by a single empire, held the strategic balance of the Mediterranean for half a millennium. Greek fire didn't just change one battle. It preserved the Byzantine Empire for 500 years. Without it, Constantinople would have fallen to the Arabs in the 7th century, 800 years before it actually fell to the Ottomans. The entire trajectory of European civilization, the preservation of Roman law, the transmission of Greek philosophy to the Renaissance, the existence of an Eastern Christian empire as a buffer between Islam and Western Europe, depended on a liquid whose recipe was entrusted to one family and transmitted by word of mouth. And the recipe that held the line between two worlds is gone forever. Every attempt to reconstruct it has produced something that burns. None have produced something that burns on water, adheres to surfaces, resists extinguishing, and can be projected under pressure from a bronze siphon, all simultaneously. The formula wasn't just chemistry, it was a weapons system, and the system died with the empire. Number 2. The Ulfbert swords. In the 19th century, archaeologists excavating Viking-era burial sites across Scandinavia began finding swords with a peculiar inscription inlaid in iron wire along the blade. Plus VLFBERHT plus. Over the following century, approximately 170 Ulfbert swords were recovered. From Norway, Sweden, Finland, Germany, Russia, and even as far south as the Mediterranean. They span a production period of roughly 200 years, from about 850 to 1050 AD. The name was assumed to be a maker's mark, a medieval brand name, like a Viking-era trademark. But when metallurgists began analyzing the blades in the late 20th century, they found something that didn't fit the timeline. Genuine Ulfbert swords, the earliest examples, dated to the 9th and 10th centuries, were made from crucible steel. The carbon content reached 1.0 to 1.4%, evenly distributed throughout the metal. The slag content was negligible, nearly pure. This meant the iron ore had been heated to at least 1,600 degrees Celsius inside a sealed crucible, a process that liquefied the metal and allowed impurities to separate completely. The problem: European bloomery furnaces of the 9th century could not reach those temperatures. Bloomery iron, the standard European product, was spongy, full of slag, with inconsistent carbon distribution. It was adequate for tools and average weapons. It was not capable of producing the steel found in Ulfbert blades. That technology would not appear in European metallurgy until the Industrial Revolution, roughly 800 years later. So where did the steel come from? The answer emerged from trace element analysis and isotopic signatures published in academic journals, including a key paper by Alan Williams of the Wallace Collection. The crucible steel in genuine Ulfbert blades matched steel produced in workshops across Central Asia and the Islamic world, particularly in modern-day Uzbekistan, Iran, and Afghanistan. The Volga trade route, running from Scandinavia through Russia to the Caspian Sea and into the Islamic heartland, was the pipeline. Viking traders exchanged furs, amber, and slaves for ingots of crucible steel, which were then forged into blades by Scandinavian smiths. The inscription plus VLFBERHT plus was not just a name, it was a guarantee of material origin, the medieval equivalent of a quality certification. The buyer knew the blade contained Central Asian steel, and they paid accordingly. An Ulfbert sword cost the equivalent of a farm. A warrior carrying one was advertising not just wealth, but access to a transcontinental supply chain that most of Europe didn't know existed. Then, around the year 1000 AD, the Volga trade route collapsed. Islamic political fragmentation, the decline of the Samanid dynasty, and shifting trade patterns severed the pipeline. The flow of crucible steel into Scandinavia ceased, and immediately, the archaeological record shows a surge in counterfeit Ulfbert swords. blades inscribed with the name, but forged from inferior bloomery iron. The counterfeits are identifiable by misspellings, plus VLFBERH plus T instead of plus VLFBERHT plus. They looked the same. They performed nothing like the originals. Medieval forgery at an industrial scale. Proof that the brand was more valuable than the blade. To put this in perspective, the Bessemer process, which allowed Europeans to mass-produce steel of comparable purity, was patented in 1856. The Ulfbert swords were forged between 850 and 1000 AD. For nearly a millennium, Europe produced inferior metal. And for a brief window of roughly 150 years, a small number of Viking warriors carried blades that contained steel the rest of their continent would not understand how to produce for another 8 centuries. The truly disturbing aspect isn't that Vikings had access to steel 8 centuries ahead of European capability. It's the implication about what else traveled along those trade routes that we haven't found. If crucible steel was moving from Uzbekistan to Norway in the 9th century, what knowledge, what techniques, what ideas moved with it, and what was permanently lost when the route closed? The Ulfbert swords survive because steel survives. Texts, techniques, mathematical knowledge, medical practices, anything transmitted on organic material along that same route would have decomposed centuries ago. The swords are the evidence that survived. They are almost certainly not the most important thing that traveled that road. Number 1. The Voynich manuscript. In 1912, a Polish-Lithuanian book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich purchased a collection of old manuscripts from a Jesuit college in Frascati, Italy. Among them was a small book, roughly 23 by 16 centimeters, bound in limp vellum, containing 240 pages of text written in an unknown script, illustrated with drawings of plants that don't exist, astronomical diagrams that correspond to no known system, and images of naked women bathing in networks of interconnected tubes filled with green liquid. Radiocarbon dating, conducted in 2009 by the University of Arizona, placed the vellum between 1404 and 1438 AD. The ink is consistent with 15th century composition. The book is genuinely medieval. Everything else about it defies explanation. The text contains approximately 170,000 characters, written in a script that uses between 20 and 25 distinct glyphs. The writing flows left to right with clear word boundaries and line structure. Statistical analysis shows the text follows Zipf's law. The frequency distribution of words matches patterns found in natural human languages. It has entropy values consistent with a real language. It is not random. It is not gibberish. By every mathematical test, it behaves like meaningful communication. And yet, no one can read it. The National Security Agency attempted decryption during the Cold War, the same codebreakers who cracked Soviet communications. They failed. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park examined it, the same team that broke the Enigma machine. They failed. In 2017, a team at the University of Alberta applied artificial intelligence, natural language processing algorithms trained on hundreds of languages. The AI suggested Hebrew as a possible root language, but could not produce a coherent translation. The manuscript defeated cryptographic methods designed to crack military-grade ciphers. In January 2026, a study published in the journal Cryptologia proposed that the text uses a layered positional cipher, a substitution system encrypting Latin or Italian using structured tables and randomization tools like dice and playing cards. The researchers demonstrated that such a cipher, using tools available in 15th century Europe, could produce text with exactly the statistical properties observed in the Voynich manuscript. But demonstrating that such a system is possible is not the same as cracking it. The manuscript remains unread. The botanical illustrations are equally disturbing. Over 100 plant drawings fill the manuscript's herbal section. Some resemble real species: sunflowers, ferns, water lilies. Others are composites of multiple plants, roots from one species attached to leaves from another, flowers that exist nowhere in nature. Several depict species that do not exist in any botanical catalog, past or present. Some researchers have proposed that the plants represent medicinal recipes drawn from memory rather than observation. A pharmacological text encoded in visual shorthand that only the author could decode. The astronomical section contains circular diagrams with stars, suns, and moons, arranged in patterns that correspond to no known celestial system. Some cosmological rosettes appear to show interconnected cities or regions linked by pathways. The biological section shows small female figures immersed in pools connected by elaborate plumbing, a scene with no parallel in any known medieval manuscript tradition. No other 15th century document depicts anything remotely similar. But here's where the Voynich manuscript becomes genuinely terrifying. Consider what it implies. A single person, or a small group, in early 15th century Europe created a book-length text in a cipher, or language, that 600 years of scholarship, military intelligence, and artificial intelligence cannot break. They illustrated it with plants that may encode pharmaceutical knowledge now permanently inaccessible. They bound it in a format designed to survive centuries, and they told no one how to read it. The manuscript passed through the hands of Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who paid 600 gold ducats for it, the equivalent of a nobleman's annual income. It moved through alchemists, Jesuits, and antiquarians. It sat in a chest in a Jesuit college for 250 years before Voynich found it. And in all that time, not a single person left a key, not a marginal note, not a letter, not a companion document explaining the system. Either the key was deliberately destroyed, or the author intended the manuscript to be permanently sealed. The truly disturbing aspect of the Voynich manuscript isn't the text we cannot read. It's the knowledge it almost certainly contains. Medical, botanical, astronomical, that someone considered important enough to encode, protect, and preserve for future generations. Generations that, 6 centuries later, still cannot access a single word. Whatever the author knew, whatever they recorded, whatever they believed was worth encrypting into permanence, it remains locked inside 240 pages of vellum in the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University. The cipher has not been broken. The plants have not been identified. The women in the tubes have not been explained. And the author's name, language, nationality, and purpose remain completely unknown. The Voynich manuscript didn't just rewrite medieval history. It proved that the medieval mind was capable of creating something that the modern mind, with all its technology, all its computing power, all its linguistic databases, still cannot understand. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.